Hi everyone, here's the chemist once again. Last year I filmed a couple of videos about the life of a PhD, what being a literature PhD entails, and since then a few of you have asked me about the whole application process, how one should go about applying for a PhD. It can be a mysterious process, it can be daunting, and today I'd like to film a quick video to tell you a few things, a few guidelines that should hopefully be helpful to you if you're thinking about doing a PhD, applying for one. A few disclaimers, of course, this video is going to make so much more sense if you are interested in a PhD in the humanities. I study literature in particular, but if you study history, the classics, art history, it's probably going to be kind of a similar process. Of course, doing a PhD, for instance, in the hard sciences is a completely different thing. I have friends who do that, and their life involves going to a laboratory every day rather than some, independent study-based research, reading books and producing original commentary on those. The other important thing to know is that doing a PhD varies immensely already from one institution to the next. It's a completely different experience according to the country where you're going to do your PhD. If you do it in the US, if you do it in the UK, if you do it in continental Europe, it can be a completely different experience. It can be a straight up course involving modules and classes and essays you have to produce. It may involve some type of job. For instance, I know that some Swiss universities make their PhD students work in their libraries, or it can just be straight up 3 years of independent research with a few discussions in the middle with your supervisor or with a committee. I'll try to keep everything general so that it is all the more relevant no matter where you're going to apply. So first things first, if you are thinking about applying for a PhD, one thing you should definitely do is ask for the support and for the help of someone who knows their shit more than the book chemist, better than me. This is probably going to be your thesis supervisor if you are working, if you're doing your BA or your master's at the moment, but it can also be someone who, work with you on a long project. The world of academia in general is really mysterious, really arcane, and the advice of someone who is within that world, who's working in that world, is priceless. Some of the advice my supervisor gave me when I was applying for the PhD included, for instance, how to prepare for interviews. The idea that, for instance, the American system and American universities prefer candidates who are more certain about their ideas and are more assertive, whereas the UK system tends to misread assertiveness as arrogance and prefers people who are careful with their claims. These, of course, are just general rules of thumb, but they're very useful. Another suggestion concerned, for instance, the reference letters. If you're going to apply for a PhD, you'll probably be asked to produce a couple of reference letters from people who know about you, know about your skills, and know about you as a student. And one suggestion I got was that, of these two reference letters, one should come from a professor who is an established professor, for instance, because they work at a prestigious university, whereas the other one should come from someone who knows you very well and who has followed you through a long process, for instance, the writing of your thesis. Again, that does not mean that, the person who knows you very well is going to be a no one. If they're a university professor, they are already an expert in their field. And it does also not mean that the person who is, that prestigious figure should just be someone who does not really know you, but, is going to write the reference letter because you begged them. You just have to strike a sort of balance. As you can see, this is really not the type of shit you find through an online research. It's the type of suggestion that only an expert can give you. Do ask for the advice of your supervisor or of someone who knows you well and knows what you're going to do. Another recommendation I received, which I think makes absolute sense, and the more I spend time as a PhD, the more sense it makes, is that when you are applying for a PhD and you are deciding where to apply, what should guide you is not really the prestige of any specific institution, but where will you be able to do your research to the best of that research possibilities. What does that mean? It means that, for instance, if you are studying a specific author or a specific period in history, maybe there's a university who has a collection of correspondence from that author, or who has an extensive library including texts from that time in history. That's a great reason why you should study there, why you should do your PhD at that institution. Even if, like me, you study contemporary literature and your research isn't really anchored to a specific collection or to a specific library, even then you should probably choose carefully your PhD supervisor, and you should choose someone who is an expert in your field. For obvious reasons, the feedback they're going to give you is going to be all the more precious if they know very well what they're talking about. If your supervisor is not really an expert, doesn't really know too well the area of your research, they will still give you great advice and they will still guide your research, but for obvious reasons they won't be able to contribute to your PhD thesis as well and as extensively as someone who, actually knows what you're talking about, actually has studied that stuff for a few years. Basing your selection on this kind of criteria may mean that you'll need to go to a university that is very far from you, and doing a PhD is a tricky business because probably you'll be at that stage in life where maybe you have a boyfriend or a girlfriend, maybe you're thinking about settling down in a specific place, maybe now you know where you'd like to live in life, so it can be tricky to go to Sweden just because they have a good collection of texts there. But do keep in mind a couple of things. The first one is that, generally speaking, again, it depends on the system, but doing a PhD in the humanities is a largely independent type of work. Which means that you'll have to discuss with your supervisor, you'll probably have to go to your uni for meetings and for maybe a couple of courses or stuff like that, but it's generally fine if you do not live in that town where your university is for all of the 3 years of your PhD. I, for instance, do not live in the same city as my university, and during my first year I lived quite far away. I had to take a train. I had to spend about 3 hours on a train to get to my uni, but that was fine because I only had to go there every once in a while. Keep that in mind. The other thing you should keep in mind is that you can also study in an institution where there's a good collection or where there's an expert in your field, even just for 1 year. Maybe you can apply for a PhD at a university close to you and then spend 1 month, 6 months, 1 year at another institution as a visiting scholar. Do not be afraid to just write this expert or write the curator of this collection and say, hey, I'm doing research on this stuff. Your help will be priceless, and maybe you can arrange things. And I know of several people who have become visiting scholars in the course of their PhDs and who have spent several months, if not whole years, in institutions at the other end of the world. The other tricky part when it comes to applying for a PhD is the funding. Of course, it's going to be 3 years of study, and again, this depends largely on the system. In Italy, for instance, you can do a PhD without a studentship, and some people do, and there's nothing wrong with it, but the large majority of PhD students do get a studentship, and you know about it from the start, whether you'll have to be self-funded or whether you are going to be awarded a studentship. In the UK, for instance, it is so much more common for students to be self-funded. Studentships are available, they are there, but most PhD students have to pay for the PhD themselves, either by, with the help of their parents or their relatives or whatever, their loved ones, or because they have stopped a few years and they've, put some money aside, or because they're doing it as a part-time job. What I'm going to tell you is that even if you decide that you want to do your PhD, and even if you are not able to get some funds from the start, do not be discouraged and keep your eyes peeled for funding opportunities, because they are so much more common than you may think. There's this general belief that there's no money in the humanities. That's not entirely true at all. You can get small scholarships, small funding for instance, to attend conferences. You can maybe work for your supervisor, helping him or her with their research. You can work on campus if you want. And, you know, studentships sometimes just come up. I, for instance, when I was accepted by my university, I didn't have a studentship, and I was convinced I would have to pay for my PhD by myself. But then a few months later, before the beginning of my course, a studentship opportunity did come up, and I applied and I got it. I got a full studentship, and that was great. So don't be necessarily too discouraged from the beginning. Of course, a great way of getting some, money while you're doing your PhD is through teaching, which is also very, very good for your CV if you plan to stay in the world of academia. Not all PhD systems allow PhDs to teach. That is quite common, for instance, in the UK. It is not so necessarily common in Italy, not everywhere at least. Again, it depends on your system. Be aware of that. My final suggestion is that when you're applying for a PhD and when you're deciding what you should focus on and what your research is going to be for the next 3 years, try to the best of your possibilities to choose something that you're going to love. Because it's going to be a job, and it's going to be very difficult if you are not committed to it. I keep hearing this idea that studying literature makes you hate it. Some people, for instance, are convinced that I do not like, I'm not as obsessed with Infinite Jest as I was before because I studied it too much. In my opinion, that's bullshit. The fiction I study for my PhD, Chabon, Pynchon, Diaz, Lovecraft, all of these people, the more I read them, the more I love their stuff. And even if I dropped out of my PhD tomorrow, I would still be rereading their stuff over and over again, I think. That's not necessarily the case for everyone. Some people may do brilliant PhDs on authors they do not care about too much because they see some research opportunities. In my own opinion, it just makes your life so much easier if you enjoy actually, if you can always remind yourself, I'm doing something I thoroughly enjoy, even when, you have to write a very boring essay and you have to read so many boring secondary sources, and you kind of forget why are you doing this in the first place. These are really general suggestions. I hope there was some sparkle of utility, of usefulness someplace in this video. Do let me know about your experience. Let me know if you're applying for a PhD wherever, and let me know what passes through your mind, as always, in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Bye, guys.